Hi, I'm Ketki.
And I'm Sanaya.
We're two curious overthinkers who love pop culture. In this podcast, we'll be dissecting pop culture and technology trends and how they're shaping everyday life. Ever watched a TV show or movie, read an article, or heard a song that made you stop and wonder what it reflects about us and the way that we live our lives? That's where we come in. Welcome to Dude, I Was Thinking, where no thought is too fleeting to dissect, analyze, and follow down the rabbit hole.
In this episode, I think we will need more self-awareness per second
For sure.
than any other episode for a long time to come, I imagine, because we are talking about English in this episode, the language. Specifically, I think what the ongoing cultural and socio-economic significance of the language is in India. And I think it'll be useful to kind of look into the genesis, I suppose, of this episode. Yeah. I feel like in some senses it began in 2018, but it began in last year when we were talking about this article by Sajid Pai. Yeah. He's a venture capitalist right now, at least. But he had written this article about what he was calling Indo-Anglians, which he described as the fastest growing caste in India. And I think he came under like some amount of criticism for what was thought to be a very like reductive understanding and analysis of like caste as a grouping, and him like equating it to like just knowledge of English. But essentially, I remember reading this article in 2018 and feeling seen, but not in a very like comfortable way. So Indo-Anglians, I think he like was trying to describe a group of people that I think we fall into very much.
Yeah, and like crucial to point out that it's a play on the word Anglo-Indian, of course, like if that wasn't obvious.
Yeah, he was like searching for a terminology to describe people who speak English as a first language and are more comfortable speaking English than their mother tongue, and for the most part speak English at home. And as a result, lifestyle choices, cultural consumption, the kind of things people like to do in their spare time, like it's very specific to a very westernized notion of a life. And he was looking for a term to describe what he's calling a psychographic, which is not just demographics when it comes to like socioeconomic class or caste, but also what are the psychological characteristics of this grouping. And I think the term he settled on was Indo-Anglians. And I think it's also useful to kind of like read a little bit of this article, or just to understand how he was describing it. I think what he said is these are people who speak English predominantly at home. They constitute an influential demographic, or rather a psychographic in India, affluent, urban, highly educated, usually in intercaste or interreligious unions. I propose to call them Indo-Anglians, he says. So, yeah, I think while I was reading this article, I remember thinking like he was breaking down these people in terms of not only comfort with speaking in English, but the kinds of jobs they tend to have, the kinds of educational institutions that we study at. And he was talking about like, and obviously like the schooling system plays a huge role in English language education. So it starts with like private schools, and then it moves into like private universities, which includes stuff like Manipal and Symbiosis International University, which is where I studied. So that was a good feeling. And like obviously these people are concentrated in bigger cities in India, and not just in the big cities, but very specific localities. So like South Delhi in Delhi, Koregaon Park, Kalyani Nagar in Pune, whatever the fancy part of Bombay is.
South Bombay, I guess. Bandra now, but I feel like that's still slightly contentious with certain South Bombay people. I'm not sure. But urban pockets, like, or very like the cool, you know.
TBD, Bombay, affluent, fancy neighborhood.
Yeah. I feel like even Powai is a part of it. Andheri is a part of it.
Are you saying this as someone who like grew up in Powai but not in South Bombay?
I mean,
not grew up, but whatever.
I'm like, come on, I have to stand up for my people. So.
Yeah, my people are Pune people, and I did not grow up in Kalyani Nagar or Koregaon Park. My parents recently moved to Koregaon Park Annex, so I have always been an annexed
Indo-Anglian.
Indo-Anglian, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, very specific neighborhoods, very specific schools.
Obviously, like, I'm sure there are outliers, but it's the idea of the people that live in these neighborhoods.
And I think like the part of this article that kind of got to me and I still think about is talking about like the kinds of names that these people have. And I think he was like quoting another article which was about first word yoga names, and examples of this would be like Kiara and I don't know, Kabir and Adi and Shania. Yeah, see, listen.
You felt personally attacked by that.
I kind of resent the fact that Karan Johar decided to name his character in that movie, Student of the whatever, like Arya Bhatt's character Shania, like, because, you know, like, I don't want that to be the association that people have with my name. But yeah, I think like the whole point of this article was to think about this grouping of people who are not large in number, but like have a certain amount of cultural capital. And I think that's what's really interesting to explore through this episode, which is like, it's not necessary that like English speakers or people who speak English as a first language are necessarily the richest people, you know, but they do have like some kind of like access to social circles, or like they form a part of what we like kind of call the cultural elite. But I don't know, I think I want to like dig a little deeper into that as well, because like what impact do they really have, like what cultural significance do they really have? And I think like it started with Indo-Anglians, but then I think we started thinking about like what kind of audience this is, right, for like cultural like production or content on streaming platforms. And I think that's when we chanced upon Eternally Confused and Eager for Love, which was an informative when it comes to trying to understand what this audience is. But yeah, like, what did you think about it? Because you've seen it twice now.
I know.
You've seen the whole show twice.
One more time than I would have wanted to, to be very honest. But
I've only seen it for like research purposes.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, honestly, like, the funny thing is that like once you actually start watching the show, you don't really mind it as much. But it did pose some interesting questions, because I think we read this article and then for some time now we had been kind of thinking about like, what is this level of fluency, right? Like, to be a native English speaker, what kind of like vocabulary does that open up for you? And as a result, what is the kind of like access you have to like, say, Western ideas or Western content? And
jobs.
Jobs, things like that. Like, how does that open up? And I came across this show, Eternally Confused and Eager for Love, which is produced by Zoya Akhtar's production company, Tiger Baby Films. And it's basically a show about this like awkward, lonely 20-something-year-old boy living in Mumbai with his parents, who's desperately looking for a girlfriend. And the character,
he wants to get laid, right?
Yeah, he's a virgin still, and he wants to get laid. And the whole show is basically this quest of him trying to like lose his virginity, essentially.
Like, relatable to so many people. I'm like, like, this is such a classic Indian tale, you know, like 20-something dude who lives with his parents and works in some tech company wants to get laid. An everyman story.
Yeah, for sure. But the characters and tropes in the show are very like coded with this like Western awkward teen, like all of the tropes in like Western teen films.
Yeah, I mean, I would not immediately think of this storyline as something that resonates with a large audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're talking specifically in India, right? Like, because when I was watching this show, I'm just like, oh, okay, whoever wrote the show has definitely seen Superbad. They've seen American Pie. They've seen Napoleon Dynamite. And what they've tried to do is, by the way, this character's name is Ray, which I think is definitely a very first world yoga name, because he's not Christian. He's very much like a Hindu character living in South Bombay.
He has a subconscious who is voiced by Jim Sarb.
Oh, yeah. You had an interesting observation about that.
I did.
Big mouth?
Yeah, I mean, I did. Which is, so, I mean, what struck me the most about this show is that it seemed to be targeted at an audience that has sort of done this required reading almost. Like if there was someone doing market research for this show, I imagine they're like, the audience that wants to watch It Only Confused and Eager for Love has probably seen How I Met Your Mother, has probably seen all these movies that you listed, has probably seen like Netflix's other show about like, you know, puberty, sex, sexuality, which is Big Mouth, which also has like, you know, this like anthropomorphic like hormone monster that is speaking to you about like your true desires, and you know, it's almost like an imaginary horny friend. And similarly, you have like supplanted that same trope and put it into this show. But I think the interesting part is like, who are these people who have done this required reading and for whom this is a new appealing show? I mean, clearly you, K3, because you wanted to watch it recreationally. But it's interesting because like Netflix has invested a lot of money because it's an original production.
I mean, this is a show by an Indo-Anglian for Indo-Anglians, like 100%. And all of that
you educated.
I mean, and there's definitely like things which I think are certain, like self-aware about the show. Like Ray can't speak Hindi properly, right? And that's something that Sajid Pai says.
And he reserves his Hindi speaking in very like specific scenarios.
Yeah, like he only will speak to the house help in Hindi, or like watchmen or janitors, etc.
There's even a scene where he struggles with Hindi, so he like reverts to English, which like, you know, it's happened to the best of us.
Yeah,
you can't help but I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely some, you know, interesting touch points, which I feel like when I was watching the show, I'm like, okay, they're trying to speak to a specific class or subsect of Indian.
Yeah.
You know, like he is this privileged South Bombay kid. You know, he gets served breakfast in his room. He's got a job that his father secured for him. He's unbothered by impending like unemployment, but he's also not like massively rich. But there is this like whale of privilege that exists around him. But
so he lives in Bandra, not in Nariman Point. Am I getting it right?
He lives in South Bombay in the show.
Okay, I'm from Pune. I don't need to know what's happening in Bombay.
Some South Bombay people, if they're listening to this podcast, are deeply upset by what you just said. But anyway, but basically, like there's this. But then there are certain moments in the show where there's definitely a stretch. Like, for example, Ray's parents, who he lives with, which is a reality for a lot of Indian 20-year-olds, right? Mm-hmm. His parents, who he lives with, are extremely forward, sex-positive parents who are very okay with him bringing girls home. There are certain things which, you know, are accurate representations of like this kind of Indo-Anglian, and certain things which are definitely a stretch, which I felt like were tropes that were entirely borrowed from Western
right. Yeah, like
films.
Recurring themes in like English language productions, right? I think like sex being a normal part of life, a part of like a young person's life, was something that like appears very often in like movies, I would say, which maybe not necessarily are written in English, but like have this like audience who's done this quote unquote required reading that we're talking about, which is being well versed in like international cinema basically, and the language and the aesthetic language, the visual styles of international cinema. Like there are certain themes that keep appearing, and like you know, being young, independent, urban life, like sex being a normal part of like a young person living, like, you know, being like independent from your parents, etc. Like these are the things that keep appearing.
And like crucially, like in this show also, right, like because most of the show is in the English language and these characters are conversing with each other in the English language, like a lot of the themes, a lot of the ways in which they're talking about sex is like things that you could definitely pick out of any Hollywood movie, you know. So I think that is something that is interesting to note. And what that basically, you know, kind of like brought me, like when I was watching the show, I was just like, okay, this is interesting because A, I'm tying it back to this Sajid Pai article, and two, it's like, why has Zoya Akhtar chosen to invest in this particular show? Like, what was the intention behind this show? Is there an audience for it? I don't think it did big numbers, but definitely is an audience. But I don't think it's the most relatable content out there. That's still okay. But are they trying to create like some kind of like an aspirational show about, you know?
I mean, I think at this point, you know, it's like, it's interesting because now we're talking about a very like narrow segment, right, of English speakers. But it's interesting to then just think about, like, look at this entire phenomenon through like the lens of language and think about English more broadly, right?
And do some self-reflection, I think, about, you know.
My favorite pastime. But yeah, like just want to think about English more broadly. Like you said this thing about it being aspirational, which historically it has been. Like, you know, right from you start English comes to India through colonial rule. Right after independence, you have like a class of people who are well versed in English. They tend to be bureaucrats, they tend to be like clerical workers in governments, etc., and working in administrative jobs, and they have access to this language. And then comes liberalization, and you have like an entire like service sector which is booming. So like access to English then gives you access to like these jobs
Yeah.
and like global flows of information. And I just want to see like what does it mean to be like an English speaker, or what does English mean to people now, because like we've been like liberalized, globalized for more than 30 years. Things have changed drastically, like whether it comes to like technological innovations, like we have more smartphones than ever before, internet is cheaper than ever before, we have like streaming platforms. And like what has this meant for people's desire to learn English? Is
Yeah.
it still aspirational? Like what is this like cultural phenomenon of like being closer to English than you are to any like Indian language or your native tongue? So dude, I was thinking, what does it mean to speak English in India in like 2023? So I feel like one thing that is interesting to me about like knowledge of like just language in class, right? When we're thinking about that, is to sort of like decouple this notion of like the economic elite
Yeah.
and like cultural elite on the other hand, right? Like, because we know that not all English speakers are affluent, and like vice versa, not everybody who is like at the top 0.001% is necessarily like an English speaker or someone whom you would classify as like English first, or an Indo-Anglian, if we had to borrow Sajid Pai's terminology
Yeah. And I
in this
think we have
episode.
a pretty interesting guest who's joining us for this episode. I think she couldn't be a more perfect guest.
Suspense.
Suspense. So, our guest for today's episode is Tara Kapur. Tara Kapur has 14 years of experience in the media industry across content, marketing, brand building. But most crucially, she currently leads marketing for Duolingo English Test in India. She has previously worked at Netflix and Vice Media and is also a founding member of Vitamins 3, a content platform focused on empowering girls through storytelling. Tara is an award-winning marketer, with her work getting recognized by coveted global awards such as Spikes Asia, the Clio Awards, Webby Awards, as well as many well-recognized Indian award shows such as Curious Creative Awards and the Effies.
Tara, firstly, thank you so much for joining us and making time for this interview. As you know, in this episode, we want to understand what it means to speak English in India, who English speakers are, and what the ongoing like cultural, socio-economic relevance of English is in this very transformed landscape that we find ourselves in, both culturally, socio-economically, in terms of technology and access to technological platforms that we have right now. So to start with, like maybe you can like tell our audience a little bit more about the kind of work you've done in the past and what you're doing with Duolingo right now.
Thanks so much for having me, first of all. And I think just a quick background on myself. I've been working in India for the last 15 years, primarily based in advertising and marketing. But I started my career as a journalist. I was reporting on marketing and advertising for about 6 years before I kind of transitioned to the roles that I have done in the later part of my career. So I think for me, a large part of what I was doing was just like looking at consumer trends and consumer behaviors that sort of evolved, especially in the corporate space. My current role is to market the Duolingo English test in India, which is a high stakes English proficiency test that students typically use when they want to study abroad. So it's one of those requirements that people from countries like India will need if they need to study abroad. And I think that's also the basis of a lot of the conversation that we're going to have around the importance that English plays as people sort of navigate their futures, whether it's professional or education and things like that. But that's a quick summary of what I'm doing right now.
Thanks so much. We're so thrilled to have you join us today, because I think you're like this blend of experience that you have, like both in media as well as now, like working with an education app that deals specifically with languages. I like your perspective would be incredibly valuable for the kind of questions we have been asking ourselves. And I think, to start with, like just to get the lay of the land, I think what we wanted to get your take on is who are English language speakers in India? Because we find that the stats are a little fuzzy. The most recent publicly available data is from 2011. So, just from whatever information you may have, like, who are English language speakers in India?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And like you said, it's a little difficult to absolutely quantify number wise given our population and the size of this country and things like that. But for me, what makes sense is when you look at it from a percent perspective, right? So for me, it's 10% of Indians that speak English. So, can hold conversation, can communicate in the language. And it's about 5% of the population is actually fluent, so can read, write to a certain standard of English. And when you look at it just from that, you're like 95% of this country actually can't read or write in the language and is not fluent in English, right? Which is surprising because, you sort of look at the country and you think that it's a much larger number, but those are kind of the silos and bubbles that we live in when it comes to things. And I think when you look at English learners, it's broken down into two or three buckets, right? There's the person that's learned English throughout their life. They speak English, at a regular basis, so for example, you and me would probably fall in that bracket as people who are very comfortable. English is very natural to them. Then there's the people that have learned English as a second language. So their day to day would be in their mother tongue. And then they use English when they need to sort of adapt professionally, or, it's what they've kind of built themselves to learn and educate themselves with. And then there's the third bracket, which are the people that are not fluent in English at all and just about are getting by with, a few sentences, few words, and are really seriously starting to try and learn the language to, really improve where they stand from an economic strata perspective in society. So for me, if I'm looking at English learners, they would kind of fall in those three brackets.
Yeah, I think I wanted to pick up on something that you said, and this may be like a very simplistic question, but it's something we've been debating. Like, how do we define fluency, right, in English or any other language? Or how is Duolingo defining fluency? Are these numbers based on the 2011 census, the stats that you cited?
This is data that we have as well, but yeah, the census is a benchmark of it, but it's also updated data from other research companies that have also put together the information. So I think Leap Scholar had done a study that also looked at English learners and a few other publications
Right.
as well.
Right. So, like, okay, if we are operating with these stats, if we have like 10%, would that include people who basically can even like their level of English knowledge is just a few phrases, even? And what then do we need in order to become fluent? Is it that, you have an education from an English medium school? Are we specifically talking about people who use English actively in their everyday life?
So the ASER has a study which is kind of a benchmark that we use. So that's the annual status of education report that comes out in India. This is really extensive in terms of how they look at English language. And what I found really interesting about this is the benchmark is there's two categories, right? One is second standard English and one is fifth standard English, right? So if you're looking at it from
Right.
an Indian perspective, if you have a level of fluency across the four aspects of language, which is, reading, writing, comprehension, speaking, it is at a fifth grade level, right? So that is your
Right.
benchmark of fluency because that means you can get through your day to day, whether it is in class or if it's, in the
Mm-hmm.
real world where you're trying to get by with your day to day as well as with your job. So fifth standard is kind of the benchmark to define fluency. And that fifth standard benchmark is only being hit by 5% of the country.
Right. And this is the ASAR report you said, like Pratham
Yes,
Education Foundations, right?
yes.
Okay. So I guess like if you're operating with like these aggregate stats, like who are Duolingo's users? Like where do they fall? Like the people who use Duolingo, like where do they fall in terms of like English language proficiency? Do they fall within that 10% broadly speaking?
Yes. So when you look at Duolingo, what's really interesting is that the idea of the app is to widen access. So the fact is, it's a free app, right? You can sort of use it. It's a certain standard of education that we're hitting as a benchmark. And that has opened up access of learners across the world, not just in India, right? So if you look at our learners from India, they come from all over. So geographically, they come from all over the country. In terms of demographics, it is a much younger audience, right? Because I think it's also the first movers who adopt technology. So Duolingo is relatively new. It is not a brand that has massively penetrated in the market yet, right? So when you look at it, it's typically younger people that are using the app right now. And again, it's broken into a couple of brackets. So the first bracket would be, again, people like you and me who are very fluent in English, who probably use English as a first language. For them, the app is used more from a recreational perspective, right? It's learning other languages beyond English. And it's kind of like, hey, I'm planning to go to Spain for a vacation. I want to learn some Spanish phrases. And they love the whole gamified angle of the app. Besides that, the second bracket would be people that are learning English as a second language. Those are really serious English learners. And when you look outside the US, a very large population of Duolingo users are using the app to become more fluent in English. Those are the much more serious learners. These are people who are really using English to uplift themselves in society. And a very large bracket of that comes from India, right? These are people who need to be more fluent and more proficient in English, and they use the app to better their language or practice it a little more. And then the third bracket would be people who are learning Hindi on the app from other languages, who are people who are not necessarily, people who have learned Hindi as their first language. So we see learners from Bengali, from English to Hindi as other brackets of English learners. For the DET, which is the product that I use, the Duolingo English test, we see test takers from all across the country. And a large portion of that is also access, right? It's a digital test that's required to showcase proficiency. You've understood from the statistics that we've told you, right? Between that 5 to 10% of English speakers in the country, there's a reason that universities need these tests to be able to evaluate if Indian students can actually speak fluently or be able to attend the courses in universities abroad. And based on that, what we've tried to do is provide a test that you can take from anywhere as long as you have a stable internet connection and a computer or a laptop. So because of that, we've seen people come from really small towns across the country who have been taking our tests. So that broadening of access, I think, is really exciting in terms of the work that we've been doing in the market.
A couple of points came to mind. So Ketki and I, we've been talking about like how language helps like define like identity, or like comes to be associated like a socioeconomic class status even. And we wanted to look at English in this context. And I think just like looking at Duolingo's annual report, when we're seeing that non-English languages rank pretty highly in terms of what people are seeking out. And like you said, that for a lot of people, recreational learning for like travel or just interest, or maybe even you're a K-pop fan, right, and you want to pick up Korean as a result. It's interesting that looking at language in the formation of like this identity, it's shifting a little bit. It's not enough that you are fluent in English. It's like, I'm so fluent in English that I want to learn another non-Indian language that I'm going to do just for fun. So yeah, I wonder, are there other Indian languages apart from Hindi on Duolingo, or does Duolingo have plans?
Right now, there's Bengali as another Indian language, but I think the main focus for Duolingo right now is to really focus on the courses that they have and do that better, right? So there are other languages, they will expand slowly. But the point is, for example, we take you to a certain level of English learning. The plan for the future is to eventually get to a point where within the app, you should be able to learn seamlessly and get to an absolute level of proficiency on the app, right? So that will keep extending. What I found really interesting in terms of what you were mentioning is the kind of split, right? Where culture really influences language learning. So, that entire movement of K culture has really reflects in the kind of language learning that people are doing. So you're seeing a lot of people really learning Korean or having interest in K culture as a result, right? So you're seeing the beauty industry evolve, you're seeing K-pop as music really expand across, and that comes from people just watching the content and experiencing that lifestyle, right? But beyond that, I think English plays a very different role. So when you're looking at it, one is broadening the scope to really understand cultural nuance, which becomes where people want to expand. People are learning Urdu to sort of, be more tied to art and literature and culture in those senses. And then there are people who are like, hey, I need English to better my life, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of two ends of the spectrum, right? So one is English being that unifying language that helps you progress in society, and the other is broadening the scope of language learning to expand your cultural experiences, right?
Yeah, and I mean that's really fascinating, and perhaps like On that note, like it would be interesting to potentially like dive a little deeper into what are exactly the motivations that are driving Indians to learn English, right? Because we went on the Duolingo app and, we opted to learn English, and the language of the app was then in Hindi. And, as you're sort of registering for the course, like there's a bunch of options that pop up that ask the user, why do you want to learn English? And some of the options that came up were things like education, job, social mobility, travel. And then there were like some interesting other options that came up, like to use words appropriately or in the right context, to connect with people better, or for enjoyment. So, are the primary motivations more practical in nature for people to learn English, jobs, education, or also for things like earning some level of cultural capital? So, like to gain access to social, cultural capital spaces, etc., gain access to people and things like that.
So it's really interesting. And this is also kind of the world is in different spaces, right? In India, the primary motivators are exactly what you're saying. It's practical. So the highest reason Indians learn English on Duolingo is for school and education. And that really reflects in terms of also India being the largest market for the Duolingo English test in terms of volume, right? So India is a key market in terms of English learners learning English to educate themselves. So, school education is the primary motivator to learn. The second is work. So,
Hmm.
all of these are kind of really practical spaces. It's to kind of better themselves in society, earn higher salaries, get into better schools. That's the number one and number two reasons. And then, third part, which you spoke about, right, in terms of just adapting and becoming a little better at how they're using terms and words and things like that. That's the brain training aspect. And that's the number three in what we've sort of tracked so far. Travel and all the softer, more cultural things comes much later for Indians. And what's interesting
Right.
is if you saw this data in the US, it completely flips, where you see the cultural
Hmm.
reasons being the higher motivators for why people are using Duolingo, and then things like education and work come a little later. So it's a much more fun recreational app in your more Western countries. And as soon as you start coming towards the East, it's much more serious in terms of, really work and education being the primary motivators.
Yeah. And I guess it really becomes like the language of aspiration in that way, right? Because in India, especially, like learning English is tied to quite literally the goals that you want to achieve in life, whether they are educational or professional. But that's really, really fascinating. And I think, I mean, maybe like moving a little bit away from Duolingo, I mean, you also have experience working in Netflix and generally in media and entertainment. Maybe it would be also interesting to explore, like what is the role that language and specifically the English language play in content production or consumption on streaming platforms in India. So, something that we were thinking about, is there a language strategy in terms of, how shows or films are being developed, dubbed, licensed, etc., and how does it play into like marketing or content development decisions?
So I think this is a really interesting question because it's kind of two ends of the spectrum, right? When you look at education and you look at English, English is that universal language that sort of is essential to expand your horizons as you sort of progress in life, right? So, for
Yeah.
example, shifting to global companies, you need to know your local language as well as English to be able to present strategy plans, in a larger ecosystem. So essential from that perspective. You want to study abroad, you need to be able to speak the language to be able to learn and sort of educate yourself in those sort of universities, right? So you're pushed to learn English to improve yourself no matter where you sort of land in life, right? So even when you look at it from an Uber driver perspective, right? An Uber driver who speaks English has a lot more ability to be able to command, a higher salary versus somebody who might not be able to speak English. So
Right.
English is that one language when it comes to education, and it's essential to sort of progress yourself in that manner. And then the other end of the spectrum, you have entertainment, which is where the consumer absolutely drives what direction a platform starts creating content in, right? There's so much content out there in the world. And when it comes to content consumption, this is where the person has absolute authority to decide what they want to watch. So you want to watch something hyper localized in your language, you will find that and you will consume that content, right? So it
Mm.
kind of flips to the other end of the spectrum where people will kind of dictate where OTT platforms or even films start producing content. So whether it's you've seen the impact that even Bhojpuri films have, right, in the
Right.
country, because people will consume what is local and culturally relevant to them. And that's sort of where you're seeing OTT platforms move, right? Like there's hyper localization that is sort of coming in. You're seeing massive amounts of South Indian content being created for platforms. You're seeing people adapt dub content in multiple languages. So you're seeing massive
Yeah.
global shows being dubbed in like 10, 15 different languages because that's how people are consuming, right? So
Yeah.
it's absolutely two ends of the spectrum. So there's English for empowerment and the unifying language, and then there's hyper localization for entertainment and like how you want to spend your free time.
And who would you say is like the primary audience for content in non-Indian languages? So, English specifically, and then potentially other languages as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you look at your audiences, right? So, one way of kind of equating the audience that it would be your kind of more global trendsetter sort of profile, right? So, somebody who's influenced by global cultures, probably more westernized in terms of how what their upbringing has been like, went to an
Right.
English medium school, it's kind of depends on what sort of bracket you would put them in. So, you have this as you could call it your core trend setting audience. And then you
Yeah.
have a second layer, which is an audience that is kind of influenced by that layer. So you will have a
Hmm.
second audience. So these two audiences that will probably consume those. And then there'll be the few shows and films that, really break the zeitgeist and sort of become mass movies or mass shows. Like a Money Heist is a good example of that, right? Which
Right.
sort of expands then beyond that core cohort and goes a lot wider. But it completely depends on how those shows play out. And you can't necessarily like really classify solid demographics around this, especially when it comes to content consumption, right? Because people's consumption habits are very varied, and it's not like one person will only like one type of content. So
Of
you
course.
will have people having very distinct and individualistic tastes when it comes to what they like to watch. So you will find somebody who absolutely loves K drama, but also loves like really massy Bollywood movies, and then also likes, really graphic true crime documentaries.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to classify people's viewing and consumption behavior.
Yeah, but you did mention that, like, there is this trend setting audience, and then there's potentially like a secondary audience which responds to these trends. Could you expand on that just a little bit? Like, are you trying to say that there is potentially an audience which has an appetite for, more global content, and then they get to decide, at least in the context of India, what is potentially the trendy content to be watching? And then there's a secondary audience which sort of reacts to those trends and is like, okay, that's the cool TV show to be watching, and I'm going to be watching that. Is that how you see it playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a bit reactionary in general, right? So you
Right.
see shows that perform in Western audiences, and then this audience is the one that sort of picks up on that around the same time. So, they follow your Western actors, they understand what's sort of releasing when it's releasing, and then they'll figure out how to watch it, right? So at the end of the day, OTT platforms are providing you a library, and it just, depends on what starts trending based on how people consume that content, right? So, for example, these shows are typically created for Western audiences. This audience
Mhm.
will get influenced by that. They'll kind of consume it. As they consume it, you sort of see that kind of spreading out via social media. So you have your tastemakers, so to say, talking about these shows, and then you see the second layer that kind of gets influenced by what they're hearing from a word of mouth perspective, and then that sort of builds that influence. So, for example, you see that with Succession, right? Like Succession is not a massive show in India by any shape or form, but
Yeah.
there is a certain sect of society that absolutely loves it, is obsessed with the show, talks about it in a certain way, and then there's a new layer that is starting to get influenced, and it's what, season 4, where now people are starting to watch season 1, so it's kind of that. And why has that happened? You have a platform like Geo that's kind of opened up access, right? So it's kind of making it
Yeah.
easier to watch that kind of content as well. So access plays a massive role in it, right? Like you have your top tier audience, which are the ones who can afford to pay for a full-fledged Netflix subscription, right? So when you
Yeah.
think about it, even from how much that costs on a monthly basis, you understand why it's kind of restricted in terms of what you're consuming, because a lot of people don't watch this content because they just don't have access to it.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, if language is that barrier to access, right? Like, and if something like dubbing, for example, plays a role in providing people access to Western content. So even if you think about like Marvel shows, I'm pretty sure it followed a similar trend like Succession, I mean, like in the sense that perhaps at a given point in time, Marvel, etc., or like Western big blockbuster films, etc., was still something that were appreciated by a certain sect who could really very directly access the language of these movies. And then you see, even with like Hotstar and things like that, these platforms sort of providing dubbed versions in, like six major languages in India on the platform for these different Marvel shows and movies, etc. So I'm wondering what your take on that is.
Yeah, I think obviously dubs does play a massive role in terms of that access, but the largest part of it is affordability, right? So I think when you start seeing, like you're talking about Hotstar, right? They have five or six different models in terms of how they open that door for consumers that go wider. And then to cater to that consumer, that's where dubs sort of start coming into play, right? Because you're like, hey, there's no point me opening a door if they come to my platform and they're like, why should I watch this? I'd rather than spend 50 rupees and go and buy a theater ticket and watch one movie and then decide exactly what I'm watching instead of, coming to a platform that's got nothing of interest for me. So that's where the dubs come into play. But for that to actually have impact, you first need to have affordable options that are available, right? So
Right.
with Netflix, the whole mobile plan was sort of opening those doors. You're seeing that absolutely transform with Geo right now, right? In terms of
Yeah.
what has happened with the IPL, and you're just seeing the numbers transform already in terms of viewership, right? Because you're trying to shift behavior of consumers, and then eventually they'll adapt pricing models that sort of evolve, I'm
Mm-hmm.
assuming, in terms of how they start looking at that ecosystem. But I think affordability is a massive factor that comes into play as well, right? So even when it comes to education, that was one of the things that Duolingo was trying to do as well, right? Was improve access to education so that it's not just a price barrier that's holding people back across society, right? So when you look at the language app, you have a Bill Gates who uses the language app, and you have Syrian refugees who are using the language app. Similarly,
Mm.
for the DET, right, you have students who are taking it in your metros, but also in small towns in Tamil Nadu and Kerala and all across, Punjab and all across the country. And a large part of that is having the ability to take it. And then the second is having a price point that is affordable for you, right? And you're seeing that with the mobile phone and data, and that's sort of what has happened for OTT
Yeah.
platforms as well, right? So I think more than language, it's actually affordability, and then language is the second layer that plays into that as you move forward.
Yeah. Even at Hotstar, I think there was definitely, some level of marketing which did talk a lot about like having dubbed versions of international shows and movies as a value proposition. But
It's a
I
massive
agree.
value proposition, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like you need to kind of have hooks that sort of bring that in, right? But it's
Right.
indicators that first will come from the audience in terms of demand, right? Marvel wasn't dubbed automatically into these languages. There was a
Of course.
realization that, hey, there is a big fan base that exists in
Yeah.
these pockets, and then we will dub in those languages. It's not the other way around, right?
Yeah.
We were speaking about this earlier as well, right? When it was about Money Heist, right? The initial seasons of Money Heist were not dubbed in any Indian languages because you're like, why would Indians watch a Spanish show? But
Mm.
when you saw the demand, crop up during COVID, that's when they're like, hey, this show has massive resonance in the Indian market. Let's really localize it, right? So it was the
Yeah.
last season where we really created a campaign talking about localization and really making it feel like a local show, because that's when we're like, hey, this show is available in, so many different languages, and as Indians we love it. So we've
Yeah.
now made it accessible for you. And it was catering to a demand that was cropping up on social media, because we saw like, I don't know how many people talking about, hey, can we have Money Heist in dubs?
So, what I'm hearing is like a lot of the spaces in which this demand sort of appears and manifests, like you mentioned, is social media. And I think, like, this entire episode, I think we've been like toying with the idea of accessibility, language, and technology. Like, we're kind of like operating in this space, and that's what is kind of tying together even like Duolingo and like a streaming platform, right? So, I think like we were thinking about, like, let's say who is someone who has like a Twitter account and is likely to be tweeting about Succession. And I think like the person tweeting about Succession, what level of fluency in the language is that person likely to have? And like, just educated guess, this person is probably very fluent in English to begin with,
Yeah.
and they're the ones who are vocal on social media making something go viral, or like, when success of a TV show or movie is measured in memeability, social media conversations, etc. I think like we then, in terms of like the English language speaking population in India, we're again operating like within quite like a narrow like sliver, right? So I think like the next thing that I wanted your take on, because we've been talking so much about accessibility, is I think both Duolingo and all the streaming platforms have done is they've sort of brought like English in like people's pockets, right? Like by bringing it on the phone, gamifying it, making it more engaging. And I think over here, like focusing more on the language learners of like the Duolingo app rather than the people who would be studying abroad. I wanted to understand like your take on how Duolingo and something like Netflix and like, you know, dubbing like international content in Indian languages, like making English more accessible to wider groups of people.
So the part that I kind of disagree about what you said was that, it's just that top layer that's vocal on social media. That's not true. It just depends on where you're looking, right? You have all sorts of different sects of society vocal on different social platforms at different times, right? So when you see social sentiment as a benchmark, I think everyone as a consumer is vocal in some shape or form, but it sort of depends on where you're looking and then obviously what your understanding of those languages are, right? So a lot of times, unfortunately, when you look at the advertising and marketing world, a lot of us exist in our own bubbles as well, right? So it's kind of like
Yeah.
what we understand and how we build our approach around that. And you guys will know this yourself in terms of how you've sort of looked at your own jobs, right? But when you start digging into even Facebook as a platform or your share chats or, Moj and Takatak and, all of these million other platforms that exist out there, it's a different universe in terms of consumer behavior and what they're saying and what demands they're making, right? So a lot of that informs the decisions that companies like, any OTT platforms that we are kind of making the decisions when it comes to dub strategy, because it's also the ROI that you're getting on each language, right? There's no point either Duolingo developing 100 different languages if the long tail of that has very little usage. Similarly for dubs for languages, right? Like after a point, there's a limitation to how much brands can dub and in how many languages. So you also have to look at the ROI of those things. So I think that's one part of it, right? Which is the social media, consumer behavior, understanding, and then working backwards from there. And the other part is English is going to be a language that's around, right? Like there's nothing that anyone can really do about it from a perspective of that being that big unifying global language. And we're seeing that happen in India from an extent with Hindi, right? Like there's that push to sort of create Hindi as a one unifying language for the country. That has a lot of, we all know this, restrictions that sort of come into play and this history and
And a
culture
lot
that
of
sort of comes into play
baggage
from that
as
perspective.
Yeah.
well.
Exactly. So when
Yeah.
that happens, English becomes the language that then feels more neutral. And obviously, because it's already universal from a global perspective, it feels more natural for that to be a language that people adopt
Mm-hmm.
much quicker in schools and things like that. So I feel like it's two ends of the spectrum. Like, I don't think
Right.
English is going to take away from other languages, and it's not going to be a business strategy for companies to push
Mm-hmm.
English, because you're always going to have consumers that will want content in different shapes and forms, but you will be looking at what to prioritize based on volume, so it is a mix and match kind of approach for these things.
Right, right. And I think, like you mentioned, like school system, I think this is one thing, like a question that kept coming to me, which is, and also the fact that, like, you know, you mentioned the Asar report, right? Which is primarily like dealing with like school age children, right? And I wanted to understand how Duolingo is trying to sort of coexist with school learning, right? Like, is there any conversation around that? Like, thinking about like the level of language proficiency you attain in a school, and like is Duolingo thought of as like supplemental, or is it thought of as for older people, like once they're done with their schooling, like if they want to like learn a language at that stage in their lives? So is there any like chat about this dimension of things?
So we have Duolingo ABC, which is a kids early learning app that also exists. I don't think you can look at it as one or the other, right, when it comes to schools, right? So I would say that it is a supplementary product. It's not necessarily something that can take away from your formal school education. Also, right now, this is just one factor of it, right? It's language. And the idea is that, you will get a high standard of education from the app, but it's something that's beneficial or additional to what you're doing. In some cases, like for example, I'm learning Spanish on the app. I'm not doing any additional classes to learn Spanish, right? And for me, I can see a certain level of my fluency adapting as I learn that language. So yes, I could use Duolingo to learn the language absolutely independently, but I don't have a time frame in mind, right? I'm able to do this however I feel like, with as much time as I want to put towards it, without really understanding what my broad structure is, right? Like I'm self-learning along with Duolingo. But when you're looking at a formal education, ultimately you have a time frame, you need to learn your language, you have your homework, you're sort of testing yourself, you're doing a lot more to practice beyond just using an app, right? You have the fear that your teacher sort of puts in your mind if you're not sort of doing things. And then you have the motivators of sort of going grade to grade, right? And you do need a formal education at the end of the day for a lot of things that you need in life, right? So I wouldn't look at it as it actually being something that can take away from education. But if you're looking at it from what level of education does it provide, it is high, but it's up to you in terms of how you utilize that, right? So I think that's the difference between actual like human engagement versus using an app.
Yeah, I guess I feel like my question in my brain is, what level of education do you need in order to use the app, right?
No, so the thing is, when you start the app, it's basics, right? So it starts with the basics of a language. So you obviously you need to know the base language to be able to learn, right? So if I'm learning a different language from English, I need to have a level of understanding of English, right? Which is the Duolingo language app is sort of structured for somebody who has a level of fluency in the base language. Like you said, like the Hindi app, you need to be able to read in Hindi. Like if you're doing Hindi to English, you need to be able to read the text in Hindi to understand the instruction. So you do need that baseline of education in the language that you're using for that initial period. But Duolingo ABC is a early learning course, which is a completely different product. That's where you could be a little child who is absolutely learning from scratch.
So like a user, you have to be like comfortable in at least one like base language, basic literacy essentially. You need that in order to like then use the language learning potential, like even like tap into that language learning potential. So
Yeah,
no,
but the
that
thing is, you would have that base level using a mobile phone itself, right? So
right,
once,
yeah,
like, because it's a product that you will use on the mobile,
yeah,
you will have a
yeah.
basic level of literacy to be able to use a mobile phone, right? So you will already be picking a language that you're using the phone with, and then
Mm-hmm.
from there you're just adding that layer to your app, right? So I don't think it's necessarily limiting access, because if you're able to read what's on your mobile phone
Right,
in a certain language and that's available on Duolingo, there's not much of a barrier that I think comes in from there. But because it is a mobile product, right? So
right,
that's
right, right.
probably why you see a lot of our users being younger people who are, kind of adapted towards technology in those senses. But none of the sentences are overly complicated. It's a mobile app, so if you can use the mobile phone, then you should be able to use it in one of those languages.
Thanks so much for listening. Dude, I Was Thinking is hosted by Sanaya Chandar and Ketki Sharma. Our producer for this episode is Yash Hirave.
You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio content. Be sure to follow us at DIWTpod on Twitter and at Dude I Was Thinking on Instagram. If you have a fleeting thought you'd like us to dissect and analyze or want to collaborate, write to us at dudeIwasthinking@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for the next episode.